Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning chapter 14, which is entitled High Tolerance. And I'm going to ask you to share this episode on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I usually say that at the end of the episodes, but I think that's one of the things I want to start doing at the beginning, making this the introduction a little bit stronger. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Pocket Casts. Take some time, share this link right now, whether you share it on the Instagram story, Instagram page, Facebook story, Twitter, uh, inbox it to somebody, whatever. Just take some effort to get this shared out for us, excuse me. All right. Chapter 14, High Tolerance, Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We're about halfway through this book. Scott had no intention of fighting his eviction. He skipped his court date and never talked to Tobin about it. Instead, he focused his efforts on finding another place to live. After several calls, Pedo from Narcotics Anonymous came through. Pedo worked with landlords, repairing and filling their properties, and vouched for Scott to one he knew. The two-bedroom upper was on the near south side. It was small and bare with a treacherous balcony and no shower, but the landlord was only asking $420 a month and didn't bother with a background check. The apartment also came with Pedo's nephew, who went by DP. A baby-faced 19-year-old with several tattoos and earrings, DP had recently been released from prison, where he was serving time for weapons possession and tampering with a firearm. He had sawed off the barrel of a shotgun. DP ran with the Cobras and wanted a gun in case things heated up with the Kings. In prison, he got his GED and another tattoo that read, Beginning. One day, Pedo learned from another landlord that an old man had died in a nearby trailer park and no one had come to claim his things. So he arranged for Scott and DP to clean out the trailer in exchange for them keeping whatever they wanted. In the dead man's closet, Scott had found a pressed suit in his zip garment bag in his silk-lined suitcase. In the bathroom, he had learned the man's name from mailing stickers on American Legion magazines. But Scott found the cigarette burns next to the bed most revealing. They led him to speculate that the man was on morphine. In Scott's mind, drugs explained a lot about the world. Why this man had died alone, why Pam and Ned got tossed from the trailer park, and why he was in a stranger's home collecting shabby furniture for his apartment. The new roommates loaded a dresser and sofa into the oily bed of a Ford F-150. When the truck was full, DP started the engine and turned on loud rap music. Scott would have preferred something else. His favorite song was, quote, Salisbury Hill, end quote, by Peter Gabriel, but he didn't say anything. Scott was still on Myra's crew, but work had slowed. Myra had run through her jobs too quickly by working her men 12 hours a day, lugging washers and dryers, mattresses, sleeper sofas. When workers said they were exhausted or sore, Myra sold them painkillers. But Scott thought she charged too much. When he needed relief, he would ask Harold and Susie to meet him somewhere. Quote, I want to do what Pedo's doing, end quote, DP said. Quote, I want to come home clean and leave the house clean. I can't see myself at 30 doing this bullshit, end quote. Scott couldn't either, years ago, when he was DP's age. After unloading the furniture, DP and Scott shared a beer on their front steps. The apartment was on Ward Street, on the west side of Kinnickinnick Avenue, which the locals shortened to, quote, KK, end quote. It faced an undeveloped plot of land surrounding railroad tracks and was not far from an apartment Scott used to rent years ago when he was still a nurse and living in Bayview, a thriving neighborhood that attracted young professionals, artists, and hipsters. From their stoop, Scott and DP could see the crowning dome of the Basilica of St. Josephat. 100 years ago, Polish parishioners had emptied their savings accounts to fund the massive building project. Quote, a scaled-down version of St. Peter's in Rome, end quote. As Scott drank his beer, he joked about, quote, taking his own vow of poverty. All I'm going to do is buy some food and clothes and some drugs now and again, end quote. DP said nothing. Quote, damn, end quote, Scott said after the moment had passed. Quote, my neck and back are killing me, end quote. His shifts with Myra were beginning to take a toll. Quote, why don't you go to the doctor, end quote, DP asked. Quote, because I don't think there's anything they can do, end quote. Scott paused. Quote, they could give me Percocet. Too bad I eat them all up in one day, end quote. Then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's have a small reflection. So, what stands out again to me in this passage is just the prevalence of addiction that exists, and how addiction is something that compounds issues people are already dealing with, and can lead to people being unhoused, uh, and it can lead to people being incarcerated, can lead to people uh, being entrenched in poverty. And there a lot of, I think a lot of the mindset up until this point in history, or in this country at least, has been one of treating addiction as a crime, a issue of criminal issue of criminality, and one that does, people don't extend a lot of empathy and understanding towards. And I think you can see that shift changing now, where it is looked at more by people as a medical issue and a health crisis. And people do have more understanding and empathy, and people understand that it is a struggle. This isn't something uh, that is just overcome by deciding one day you don't want to do drugs anymore. That there are people who have physical ailments that these drugs help. People who have neurological ailments that these I don't know if help is should be the right word, but these drugs can assist them in dealing with. And so one of the things I learned from the book, The End of Policing, is understanding how a lot of times people caught up in the crosshairs of some of these issues have multiple things that they are dealing with that lead to them being caught up in these crosshairs. So somebody who may be caught up in the crosshairs of being unhoused, maybe somebody who has who's neurologically diverse, and because they can't get the proper medicine they need from being neurologically diverse because they grew up in poverty, they begin to lean on black market drugs, which leads to them having an issue of addiction. And then in the midst of having this addiction issue, it may be hard for them to continue to stay employed. And that leads to them becoming unemployed. And then that leads to them losing their house, and leads to them being on the street, and all of these things. You have to be cognizant of all of these things, instead of just judging something from face value. And I think that the way to become the more cognizant about these things and understanding about these things is by reading about them, becoming informed about them, and letting that begin to dictate your perspective, as opposed to uh, allowing ignorance to dictate your perspective. Scott still bought his Vicodin at the trailer park. He thought Mrs. Mites was the only adult there who didn't do drugs or have a history with them. Scott loved drugs. Being high was a, quote, mini vacation, end quote, from his shame of a life. He took the trip whenever he could afford it. Scott had gotten high with Pam and Ned shortly before they received their eviction notice, and had moved in a hurry, leaving behind a couch, beds, dressers, and other large items. Scott figured Ned and Pam got what was coming to them. In his old life, before the fall, he might have been more sympathetic, but he had come to view sympathy as a kind of naivete, a sentiment voiced from a certain distance by the callow middle classes. Quote, they can be compassionate because it's not their only option, end quote, he said of liberals who didn't live in trailer parks. As for Ned and Pam, Scott thought their eviction came down to their crack habit, plain and simple. Heroin Susie agreed with him. Quote, there's a common denominator for all evictions, end quote, she said. Quote, I almost got evicted once. Used the money for other things, end quote. Trailer park residents rarely raised a fuss about a neighbor's eviction, whether that person was a known drug addict or not. Evictions were deserved, understood to be the outcome of individual failure. They, quote, helped get rid of the riffraff, end quote, some said. No one thought the poor more undeserving than the poor themselves. In years past, renters opposed landlords and saw themselves as a, quote, class, end quote, with shared interest and a unified purpose. During the early 20th century, tenants organized against evictions and unsanitary conditions. When landlords raised rents too often or too steeply, tenants went so far as to stage rent strikes. Strikers joined together to withhold rent and form picket lines, risking eviction, arrest, and beatings by hired thugs. They were not an especially radical bunch, these strikers. Most were ordinary mothers and fathers who believed landlords were entitled to modest rent increases and fair profits, but not, quote, price gouging, end quote. In New York City, the great rent wars of the Roaring Twenties forced the state legislature to impose rent controls that remain the country's strongest to this day. Petitions, picket lines, civil disobedience, This kind of political mobilization required a certain shift in vision. Quote, for a protest movement to arise out of the traumas of daily life, end quote, the sociologists Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward have observed, quote, the social arrangements that are ordinarily perceived as just and immutable must come to seem both unjust and mutable, end quote. This usually happened during extraordinary times when large-scale social transformations or economic disturbances, the post-war housing shortages, say, profoundly upset the status quo. But it was not enough simply to perceive injustice. Mass resistance was possible only when people believed they had the collective capacity to change things. For poor people, this required identifying with the oppressed and counting yourself among them, which was something most trailer park residents were absolutely unwilling to do. During rent strikes, tenants believed they had a moral obligation to one another. If tenants resisted excessive rent hikes or unwarranted evictions, it was because they invested in their homes and neighborhoods. They felt they belonged there. In the trailer park, the sentiment was almost dead. For most residents, Scott among them, the goal was to leave, not to plant roots and change things. Some residents described themselves as, quote, just passing through, end quote, even if they had been passing through nearly all of their life. One, an out-of-work father of 3 who powered his trailer with stolen electricity, said, quote, we don't let family come here. It's not us. It's lower class living, and I didn't come from this, end quote. Lenny's ex-wife, who being Lenny's ex-wife was virtually married to the trailer park at one time, liked to tell people, quote, you forget that I'm the one that used to go to the opera, end quote. Tam, the pregnant drug addict, thought of the trailer park as, quote, a hotel, end quote. Poor neighborhoods provided their residents with quite a lot. In the trailer park, residents met people who knew how to pirate cable, when the best food pantries were open, and how to apply for SSI. All over the city, people who lived in distressed neighborhoods were more likely to help their neighbors pay bills, buy groceries, fix their car, or lend a hand in other ways compared to their peers in better off areas. These exchanges help people on the receiving end meet basic material needs, and they help those on the delivering end feel more fully human. But for such vital exchanges to take place, residents had to make their needs known and acknowledge their failures. For Lorraine to ask her neighbor if she could use her shower, she needed to explain that her gas had been shut off. The fact became public when she walked back to her trailer with wet hair. On another occasion, a tenant named Rose had her children taken by Child Protective Services. Trailer park residents sat beside her as she wailed. They comforted her and made sure she didn't hurt herself, but because they saw what had happened, they also judged her. Quote, it ain't nothing to be proud of, end quote, Dawn told her. Quote, but the Lord took them for some reason, end quote. When people began to view their neighborhood as brimming with deprivation and vice, full of, quote, all sorts of shipwrecked humanity, end quote, they lost confidence in its political capacity. Milwaukee renters who perceived higher levels of neighborhood trauma, believing that their neighbors had experienced incarceration, abuse, addiction, and other harrowing events, were far less likely to believe that people in their community could come together to improve their lives. This lack of faith had less to do with the neighborhood's actual poverty and crime rates than with the level of concentrated suffering they perceived around them. A community that saw so clearly its own pain had a difficult time also sensing its potential. Every so often, Tobin's tenants would air a passing remark about their landlord's profit or call him a greedy Jew. Quote, that Cadillac got some shiny rims. I know that didn't cost no $10, end quote. Quote, he just wants to butter his pockets, end quote. But for the most part, tenants had a high tolerance for inequality. They spent little time questioning the wide gulf separating their poverty from Tobin's wealth or asking why rent for a worn-out aluminum-wrapped trailer park took such a large chunk of their income. Their focus was on smaller, more tangible problems. When Witowski reported Tobin's annual income to be close to $1 million, a man who lived on the same side of the park as Scott said, quote, I give 2 shits. As long as he keeps things the way he's supposed to here, and I don't have to worry about the freaking ceiling caving in, I don't care, end quote. Most renters in Milwaukee thought highly of their landlord. Who had time to protest inequality when you were trying to get the rotten spot in your floorboard patched before your daughter put her foot through it again? Who cared what the landlord was making as long as he was willing to work with you until you got back on your feet? There was always something worse than a trailer park, always room to drop lower. Residents were reminded of this when the whole park was threatened with eviction, and they felt it again when men from big management began collecting rents. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. So let's have a small reflection. So this sentence really sticks with me. This sentence here, it says, no one thought the poor more undeserving than the poor themselves. And that is such a simple sentence, but it has so many layers to it, and it can be applied to so many different things. I think that can be true for the oppressed. No, let's see if I can rearrange this sentence. No one thought the oppressed more undeserving than the oppressed themselves. No one thought the exploited more undeserving than the exploited themselves. No one thought the incarcerated more undeserving than the incarcerated themselves. Uh, and that's psychology. That is how psychology works. That is how apathy works. That is how uh that's how so many things that exist in our society continue to be perpetuated. Is because people get caught into a cycle of poverty or cycle of exploitation, a cycle of oppression, a cycle of subjugation, a cycle of marginalization. And once you are within that cycle, part of one of the things the cycle does is it teaches you to not only or trains you to not only devalue yourself, but also devalue other people who are also caught up in this cycle with you. It teaches you to not only just blame yourself for being caught up in this cycle, but blame other people also for themselves allowing themselves to become caught up in this cycle. And that's one of the things, you grow up in this country, and one of the first things you're taught is you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you want if you just try hard enough, you just put your all in, you can be the president of the United States. And if you don't become that, if you don't live up to that potential, then it is something that you individually have done to not be able to live up to that potential. And you can't place that blame on somebody else. You can't blame somebody else for your shortcomings. And on a completely individual, isolated situation, that may very well be true for each one of us, that each one of us have a certain individual capacity and every day we wake up and we make certain decisions that have specific individual effects on us. But once you say, okay, I accept that in an individual perspective. But once you shift that perspective to a collective perspective, and you see the commonalities between the people who have these roles, who when you see and you begin to see the commonalities between people who individually are having struggles achieving more. When you begin to see that, okay, people who grew up and had parents who were black, or parents who were Latino, or who had parents who were Asian, they statistically are less likely to be able to do certain things, or are statistically more likely to have certain things happen to them. People who grew up and their parents only made $20,000 annually, or $10,000 annually, or $50,000, $40,000 annually, they had certain things that they were more likely to be able to accomplish, or that they were more likely to have to not be able to accomplish. Once you begin to look at statistics on that type of a level, once you begin to look at people who grow up on a certain side of town, who deal with specific common things because they grew up on that side of town, you begin to understand that that our environment has such a huge dictation on the people that we become. That things that are outside of our control have so much to do with who we become. We don't control the resources that are given to schools. We don't control the one second. Okay, sorry about that. We don't control the racist policies and procedures that usher out of city governments or usher out of state governments. And I know somebody will say, well, yeah, you do control those things because you vote for these people or you vote for those people. And once you begin to look at electoral politics and once you begin to look at how the system of voting works, you begin to understand that there are all types of things, whether it be gerrymandering, whether it be disenfranchisement from being able to vote, whether it be certain people who don't have people to watch their kids or can't take off work to vote. You begin to realize that everything in this country is manipulated for people in power to maintain that power, for people with wealth to maintain that wealth. And people who don't have those things are in a position of constantly being the manipulated instead of being the manipulator. Uh, and once you begin to grasp that concept, and I'm probably not using the best articulation for this right now, but once you begin to grasp that concept, you begin to understand why you can't just why you have to be more understanding to people that are poor, especially if you're poor. Why you have to be more understanding to people who are exploited, especially if you're exploited. Why you have to be more understanding to people who are oppressed, especially if you're oppressed. And that is one of the first steps to the power that exists within collectivism. And what you hear in these next paragraphs that is very informative to me is it is an explanation of how collectivism works. And when it talks about it says, in years past, renters opposed landlords and saw themselves as a quote class end quote with shared interests and a unified purpose. And so that is the exact opposite of the poor believing that poor people are undeserving. Once you begin to see other people who deal with the same type of exploitation or oppression that you deal with as part of a class with you and having mutual interests, having a unified purpose, that's the first step to being able to combat the people who are keeping you exploited and keeping you oppressed. And then in these next paragraphs, they sort of list out how that used to happen in the past, talking about strikes, talking about protest and all of these things, and then talking about petitions, picket lines, and civil disobedience. Which civil disobedience protest is a form of civil disobedience. But one of the things that stands out to me as well in this paragraph is this sentence. It says, for a protest movement to arise out of the traumas of daily life, the social arrangements that are ordinarily perceived as just and immutable must come to seem both unjust and mutable. And so that is what I'm talking about. Why I say that the first step in being able to combat these things is being understanding to first step to being able to combat poverty is being understanding to people in poverty. And then at that point, you can unify people in poverty and get them to see themselves as a class within each other. And then at that point, you can be able to explain to them about the traumas that they deal with in their daily life because they're poor. You can explain to them how this social arrangement is something that has not always existed and does not have to always exist. And also you can explain to them the unjustness that exists within it. And once you can do that, then again, that's another step towards having people being mobilized to be able to fight against that status quo. And it talks about this last sentence, and then we'll get back to reading. It says here, mass resistance was only possible when people believed they had the collective capacity to change things. And that's why you have to be able to inform people not only how change can happen and be able to lay out strategic plans, but you have to be able to inform people about the past and how things may have been in the past and how people struggle to get certain things changed in the past. And then you have to be able to put things into practice, watch something not work, come back to the drawing board and reassess. And so all of these things are just, these small sentences are things that are very elongated. It's something that's a marathon. These are all parts of marathon running when it comes to struggles. And then I'll say this last sentence again. For poor people, this required identifying with the oppressed and counting yourself among them, which was something most trailer park residents were absolutely unwilling to do. And we see a lot in the times that we live in, people not wanting to count themselves as among oppressed or subjugated groups. And because they have a hope that one day they won't be in this oppressed or subjugated group. And they sort of pointed that out when they talked about the people passing through. And that was another thing that was pointed out in the book, Citizens, Cops, and Power. One of the reasons that it was hard to build stronger communities is because people in poor communities, or one of the reasons that the poor one of the reasons that people living in poorer neighborhoods or poorer locales were having struggles in building community in those neighborhoods is because so many people were just trying to pass through those neighborhoods and they did not want to form any strong roots there. And then this last thing, and then we'll get back to reading. This sentence. This usually happened during extraordinary times when large-scale transformations or economic disturbances profoundly upset the status quo. And when we look at 2020, we look at what was going on with the Donald Trump administration. We look at what was going on with COVID. We understand why that moment with after the murder of George Floyd was such a catalyst for struggle. It had been a bad week. First, Scott lost his keys and decided to break into his apartment by putting a fist through the front window. Then his electricity went out. Then Myra fired him. Nothing personal. She had found a crew of hypes willing to work for $25 a day. In NA, Scott had learned that addiction tightened its grips when you were hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Quote, halt, end quote. And Scott was all for it. After Myra fired him, he used part of his last paycheck to get drunk and high at a friend's house. That's when he called his mom, a hospital housekeeper in rural Iowa. On the phone, Scott told his mother about his drinking, but not the heroin, and about losing his nursing license after getting hooked on painkillers. She knew none of it. Scott hadn't spoke to his mother in over a year. Quote, Mom, end quote, Scott was crying. Quote, I'm sorry. I'm a mess. I'm a fucking mess, end quote. Before Scott could finish, his mother cut him off, failing to realize that it took everything he had in him, and a 12-pack, to dial all 10 numbers and not hang up when he got to the 7th or 9th, like he usually did. She explained that she was in a van full of relatives and unable to talk at the moment. They were all going to Branson, Missouri for the weekend. Quote, but Scott, end quote, she said, quote, you know that you can always come home, end quote. Scott thought about her offer. How could he get to Iowa with no car and no money for a train ticket? And how could he find heroin there? After a day, the sick would start working its way through his body. Then there was the part about being an object of pity. Scott thought about this as he walked through Pick and Save the day after the call. He had offered to buy Heroin Susie lunch with his food stamps if she'd give him a hit. Quote, I mean, I could go back home, but damn, I'm 40 fucking years old. I have to go back and tell them, that I fucked my whole fucking life up, end quote. Scott had never reached out to his family for help. He considered their lawns and jobs and children and normal problems and concluded, quote, they wouldn't know what to do. How much help could they possibly be, end quote. Middle-class relatives could be useless that way. Scott joined the checkout line and noticed the man in front of him was buying Robitussin. Quote, you got a cold? End quote, Scott asked. Quote, yeah. Can't seem to shake it, end quote, the man said. He coughed as if to prove his point. Quote, here, end quote, Scott said. He took out a pen and scrap of paper and wrote, quote, vitamin C, zinc, and echinacea, end quote. Quote, that's what I would recommend, end quote, he said. Scott didn't go back to Iowa. Instead, he decided to go to rehab. On the morning he planned to check himself in, Scott woke up while it was still dark, trimmed his beard, and tucked in his t-shirt. He wanted to climb back out. He felt nervous but ready. When Scott stepped out of the elevator at 7 a.m., an hour before the clinic's door opened, he saw that he was late. 15 people were already in line. There were older black men who had dressed up for the occasion, a foul-mouthed white woman, 50 perhaps, in cowboy boots, a pair of young Mexican men sitting on their feet and whispering in Spanish, a 20-something black man whose pants were falling down, a brooding, white teenager who had pulled her bangs over her eyes and her sleeves over her hands. Scott slumped against the wall at the end of the line. After a few minutes, the elevator opened again and an older Mexican woman stepped out. Her hair was long and black except for a streak of gray down the middle. She wore a walking cast and looked over her large glasses with eyes the color of floodwater. She resigned herself to a spot on the floor next to Scott. The woman told Scott she had been there the day before, but they only took 4 people. When social workers began appearing at desks behind the glass, she observed, quote, they are calling the county to see how many spots are available, end quote. Quote, for what? End quote. Scott asked sardonically. Quote, for you. You're here to get treatment, right? End quote. Scott looked up at the ceiling's fluorescent lights and inhaled slowly, purposefully. He was trying to endure. Quote, yes, end quote. Quote, look at that girl, end quote. The woman motioned to the white teenager. Quote, she looks suicidal. I'll bet they take her in. You have to camp out to get a spot, end quote. Scott began to tap his foot. At 8:10 a.m., a woman wearing gold earrings and a silk blouse opened the door and announced that they could take 5 people today. A man emerged with a clipboard. Quote, number 1, number 2, end quote. He began counting. The line stood and tightened. Scott stepped toward the elevator and pushed the down button. He could have tried again the next day, but he went on a 3-day bender instead. And that brings us to the end of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15. And I think just the thing that stands out to me the most in there is just the struggle with addiction, the lack of resources that are available for people who are struggling with addiction through the state, and the information that we read about past struggles, past organizing and struggles that existed in the 1920s with housing and with dealing with landlords, and some of the information that was given about the mindset or the psychology that people in poverty have, and how that can be a sort of how that can lead to them being stuck in this perpetual cycle. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I think this was one of my favorite chapters that I've read, just specifically because of those 2 pages that we read where they sort of spoke about protest and not protest, but protest was one thing, but spoke about organizing around housing. And that's something that some of the first activists that I encountered here in Rockford, Illinois, one of the things that they would talk to me and articulate about as well is the importance of being able to organize around housing. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we will be back to finish up chapter 15, entitled A Nuisance, tomorrow. And I think we only got 2 chapters left in part 2 of this book, and then we will be in part 3. I'll let you tomorrow.